Hello 8th graders, if you're watching this video, that means that you have finished the one about metals, nonmetals, and metalloids. In that video, we talked about how the periodic table can be divided into three general groups in order to help us to understand the different elements on the table. Well, if you want to divide the periodic table even further, you would be talking about things called families. The nice thing about this is that it's really nicely named for once in chemistry. Something is nicely named. If you think about how you and your family are sort of similar to each other about some things, but nobody in your family is exactly like everyone else, that's sort of like the families on the periodic table too. The families on the periodic table are all the columns on the periodic table, except for this middle group. We'll talk about them. And every element in a family has similar properties. We've already talked about why, and it's those valence electrons. But no element in a family is identical to the others, just like a real family. So on your quick notes, or on your paper, there are some quick notes we have to take. So the first one is, what do families share in common? Well, that is their properties. They like to bond with similar things. They're often similar states, like they're gases or solids or liquids or something like that. They often have similar boiling points. They often have similar melting points, stuff like that. And the reason for that, the second blank on your paper, and that's because of all of their valence electrons. So if you remember, let's take carbon for example. Carbon is in the carbon family, and it has 4 valence electrons. Well, everything else in the carbon family also has 4 valence electrons, and that's why they behave like each other. The last one, how many families are on the periodic table? The answer to that is 11. So there are 11 different families we're going to talk about. The 2 down here, the 2 rows underneath the periodic table, each of them are their own families too. They kind of go on the outside of the scope of this class. So we're not going to talk about them very much. We're going to deal with the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 families in the main body of the table. The next step for you is to go and visit some stations. I have these stations digitally in Google Classroom, but they can also be found on paper in the actual classroom. Your job is to visit the paper for each one of the families and fill in the table. So you'll need, of course, the name. Since the valence electrons are what define the family, we're going to need them also. If you've already finished the metals, nonmetals, and metalloids, which you should have, if you haven't, you shouldn't be watching this video. I need to know, are they mostly one or the other? Are they a mix? What are they mostly made out of? And then the last one is the most important. This is where we're going to put properties. Now, a lot of these families, because they are also metals or nonmetals or something like that, they will have similar properties listed to things that we already know. Since we've already done that in the previous video, don't bother listing those properties again. Just list anything new that you find out that wasn't already written down before. Go and do that now. Pause this video. If you're still watching, you have gone and you have filled in the properties for each of the things from each of the families on the periodic table. The most important thing that you need to know or recognize is that there are trends as you move across the periodic table. Some of those trends, some of the most important ones, are things like melting point and boiling point and what kinds of states of matter. So for example, as you move across the periodic table, you're moving from metals through the metalloids and into the nonmetals, and you're basically reducing the melting point. So things on the left side have really high melting points. It takes a lot of energy to melt these things, and those are the metals. Metals can take a lot of heat. Over on the right side, some of the things on the right side, they have melting points in the negative numbers. In other words, they can be super crazy cold and melt. That's why they're gases at room temperature, like oxygen. Good thing too, because we need it to be a gas to breathe it. But as you move across the periodic table, those patterns change gradually. Same thing with densities, boiling points, all sorts of different properties. The last step for this lesson is to complete the Pick a Family in Google Forms. It's attached to this lesson. Your job is to pick one of the families off of the periodic table and pretend like the properties for those elements are sort of like the properties for a person. So here are 3 examples on your screen. So one of the properties of the oxygen group is that it really likes to bond with other elements. Well, that's sort of like a person who really likes to hang out with other people. One interesting thing that they added here, though, is that the noble gases don't like bonding with anyone, so they're the emo kids sitting in the back. And then, of course, fluorine is sort of the same way. They really want to go and steal electrons. And that would be like a person who's really interested in borrowing things from you. Or maybe the noble gases, who are just like totally zen by themselves and they don't like to be bothered and they're not bothered by anyone. That's kind of like this harmonious monk-looking person that's hovering up in the air. So now it is time to go and complete that Google form. Ready, go.